Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into a really fundamental concept in politics and international relations, one that shapes how we think about countries and their place in the world. The idea of state sovereignty.
That core idea.
Exactly. What does it truly mean for a nation state to be the ultimate authority within its own borders, completely independent and, calling its own shots in its dealings with other countries? Our sources today lay out a really compelling case that this traditional, perhaps even idealized notion of absolute sovereignty is facing some pretty significant and complex challenges in the modern world. So our mission for this deep dive is to go through the material you've provided, these articles, this research, these notes, and really understand exactly what those challenges are, where they came from historically, and what they mean for states trying to assert their authority today.
That's right. The material is our roadmap for this exploration. It's a deep dive specifically into the knowledge and insights contained within these sources you've shared with us. The text mentions that pressures on sovereignty can come from both inside a state. It touches briefly on internal dynamics, like the rise of diverse groups and pluralism, suggesting the state isn't always a single, unified entity internally. But the primary focus of this particular set of sources, and therefore where we'll concentrate our deep dive today, is squarely on the external challenges.
Right, those forces from outside.
Exactly. Those powerful forces and dynamics originating outside the state itself that work to constrain its autonomy.
Absolutely. We're going to journey through how deep historical forces that might seem like they belong in the past, major global power shifts from just a few decades ago, and the intensely interconnected economic processes that define our world today are all putting significant, undeniable pressure on the traditional boundaries of state power and independence. Get ready for some surprising facts, some specific examples drawn directly from the sources, and those big picture connections that really show just how complex it is for a nation state to navigate the world while trying to maintain that idea of absolute authority. Okay, let's start our journey by looking backward, because our sources point to the long shadow cast by something we might think of as firmly in the history books: imperialism. We often assume it's wound up, as the source puts it, like an old clock that stopped ticking, but the material suggests the forces set in motion by imperialism are apparently still very much at play today, just
Yeah.
in different, perhaps more subtle forms.
Yes, the sources are quite clear that to understand modern challenges, we need to look at this history. The material actually draws on the work of Edward Say to help us distinguish between imperialism and colonialism, because these terms are often used interchangeably. But the sources highlight a distinction from Say that's helpful here.
Okay.
According to Sadie, imperialism is the broader concept. Think of it as the general practice, the theory, the attitudes of a powerful center, a metropolitan country asserting dominance and ruling over distant territories. It's about the power dynamic, the intent, the system of control originating from the core.
You're right, the overarching idea.
Exactly. Colonialism, on the other hand, is described as the specific method or consequence of imperialism. It's the implanting of settlements on that distant territory. So imperialism is the desire and system of control, and colonialism is often the physical act of settling and directly administering that control through establishing colonies. The sources do acknowledge, though, that in common usage, imperialism is often used more broadly to encompass both the practice and the consequence, including colonialism.
And where did this modern wave of imperialism really kick off, according to the sources? Where did it gain momentum?
Well, the material traces its modern origins back to the 18th and 19th centuries. This is when we see a surge in expansion by European countries. Names like Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. These nations, having consolidated their power and industrialized, started looking outward aggressively. The key driving force, as described in the sources, wasn't primarily about spreading culture or goodwill. It was firmly rooted in economics.
Economics, right.
After their domestic trade and industry developed, they sought to expand them beyond their borders. And setting up colonies was the mechanism for that.
So the goal of establishing colonies wasn't just planting a flag. It wasn't symbolic.
Far from it. The core motive, according to the sources, was explicit: to exploit the natural resources and, crucially, the human resources of those colonized countries. This wasn't for the benefit of the colonized people. It was specifically to strengthen the economies of the colonizing powers back home. It was fundamentally a system built on extraction, taking raw materials, utilizing cheap labor, and creating markets for their finished goods, all to fuel their own industrial and economic growth.
But there was always that accompanying narrative, right? The idea that they were bringing civilization to less developed parts of the world. The sources mention this and are quite cutting about it, calling it an attempt to attribute moral dignity to the pursuit of their self-interest. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean?
Absolutely. The sources treat this as civilizing mission argument with significant skepticism. They suggest that these claims of bringing the benefit of civilization were essentially a convenient justification, a way for the colonizing powers to cloak their economically driven actions in a mantle of moral legitimacy.
So a cover story, basically.
You can say that. It was a narrative designed to make the pursuit of wealth and resources appear noble and altruistic, rather than what the sources portray it as, a calculated act of self-interest and exploitation. It's about giving a high-minded reason for something that was fundamentally about power and profit. And this exploitative nature was recognized and critiqued by thinkers even as imperialism was booming. The sources highlight key figures here. J.A. Hobson, for example, in his 1902 book Imperialism, defined it as a search for a captive market.
A captive market? What does that mean exactly?
Well, think about it this way. The colonizing country's factories are producing goods, and they need people to buy them. A colony is a perfect captive market, because the colonizer can impose rules and structures that force the colony to buy the manufactured products from the mother country, ensuring demand regardless of whether local industries could produce similar goods or if the local population truly needed or could afford them otherwise. The market is captive forced. Hobson directly attacked this as exploitation. Then the sources bring in V.I. Lenin, writing later in 1916 in his work Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Lenin's analysis, following a Marxist perspective, argued that imperialism wasn't just a policy choice by governments or companies. He saw it as an economic necessity inherent to the nature of capitalist economies in their advanced stage.
So it wasn't optional. Capitalism, by its nature, had to expand this way. It wasn't just greed, but baked into the system.
That's his core argument as presented in the sources. He believed that in highly developed capitalist countries, capital accumulates domestically to such a vast extent that opportunities for truly profitable investment at home become saturated or less lucrative. For capitalists to continue making the high returns they seek, they are compelled to look beyond their own borders for new avenues. Lenin identified three primary drivers for this outward push, according to the sources. First, the search for new spheres of investment for that accumulated capital.
Okay.
Second, the search for new markets to sell the ever-increasing output of their industrial production. And third, the search for new sources of raw materials needed for those industries, often materials not available or more expensive domestically.
Right. Investment, markets, materials, the big three.
Exactly. The sources explain that by engaging in foreign trade and investing overseas, capitalists could achieve higher rates of profit than at home, access cheaper labor, and secure raw materials at extremely cheaper rates. It was a way to boost profits and sustain the capitalist engine when domestic opportunities were perceived as insufficient. And for Lenin, this led to a fundamental global division. The sources quote him defining the essence of imperialism quite starkly. It was the division of nations into oppressor and oppressed.
Wow. Stark.
Yes, this system inherently created a hierarchy, with the imperial powers on top and the colonized nations subjected to their will and economic needs.
This oppressive system eventually led to pushback, right? The sources talk about the process of decolonization. Things started to change.
Exactly. The sources describe how the people in the oppressed, colonized nations gradually became more aware of the exploitative relationship they were trapped in. This growing awareness fueled resistance and eventually led to organized independent struggles. The process really accelerated in the wake of the Second World War, which ran from 1939 to 1945. The war weakened some colonial powers and shifted the global political landscape, creating conditions where colonial rulers began to concede independence.
Like India, the sources mention that.
Yes, the sources highlight India gaining its independence in 1947 as a very significant and early example of this wave of decolonization that swept across Asia and Africa in the decades that followed. However, and this is a critical point the sources make, gaining formal political independence didn't mean the end of exploitation or external constraints.
Ah, okay. It wasn't a clean break.
Not according to this analysis. The former imperial powers, and indeed new global players that emerged stronger after the war, found what the sources call new subtle means of continuing that exploitation. This is where the concept of neocolonialism comes in. The sources define neocolonialism as a strategy where a former colonial power might not maintain direct political control, but they continue to exert significant economic influence and engage in exploitation.
How does that work in practice?
The main ways this happens, according to the material, are by using the formerly independent countries as sources of cheap labor and raw materials. Crucially, These developing nations also remain large necessary markets for the industrial products manufactured by the now developed nations.
So they get the flag and the national anthem, but they're still tied into this economic system that doesn't really benefit them equally. They're still playing a subordinate role, economically speaking.
Precisely. The sources highlight the inherent disadvantage for these developing countries within this neocolonial structure. They often have low levels of industrial development, large populations, and limited capital and technical expertise. This means they remain primarily focused on supplying raw materials or products from labor-intensive industries. The sources note that these labor-intensive products often have low profit margins, and their prices are frequently set by the wealthy developed countries, unless the developing nations can manage to organize and exert collective power like the oil-producing countries did with OPEC.
Right.
Meanwhile, the developed countries dominate the capital-intensive and technology-intensive industries, which have much higher profit margins. The sources conclude that the international trade system, structured this way, continuously operates to the disadvantage of the developing countries. Their formal sovereignty doesn't protect them from this unequal economic structure. The sources provide specific examples to illustrate this ongoing economic relationship. They mention countries in Latin America, like Chile, Brazil, and Panama, continuing to serve as sources of cheap raw materials and labor for industries in the United States. Okay. Similarly, nations in Asia, like Taiwan, Malaysia, and the Philippines, are described as serving as backyards for Japanese industries, implying they provide a lower cost base, perhaps for manufacturing components or accessing resources, that supports the more profitable industrial core in Japan.
And MNC's multinational corporations are key players in this picture, aren't they? The sources seem to focus on their role quite a bit.
They are absolutely central, according to the sources. MNCs are portrayed as the primary agents of neocolonialism today. Developed countries invest vast amounts of capital in developing nations, and they do this through these multinational corporations. These companies then operate within the developing countries, manufacturing and marketing various consumer goods, utilizing the local cheap labor and raw materials. The huge profits generated by these operations
Flow back to the MNC's home countries.
Exactly. They flow back home. The sources also note that developing countries are often used as sites for cheap labor to produce components, which are then shipped elsewhere, likely to the developed country or another location, with the necessary technical expertise for final assembly into finished products.
So the value add happens elsewhere.
Often, yes. The sources point out that poorer countries frequently lack the expertise, capital, and infrastructure required for marketing finished products on a global scale, but they possess the essential labor force needed to run the factories, even if those factories are owned and controlled by companies from richer nations. A related phenomenon the sources connect to this is what's called brain drain. Have you heard of this?
Yes, skilled people leaving their home countries.
Right. This is the movement of highly skilled individuals, doctors, engineers, academics, other professionals from developing countries to the developed world. These professionals are often educated at significant public expense in their home countries, but they leave because they lack sufficient career opportunities or resources to practice effectively at home. The sources frame this brain drain as another facet of this economic exploitation, where human capital, developed at cost in one region, ends up benefiting the more advanced economies elsewhere. It's a loss for the developing country and a gain for the developed one.
It sounds like a persistent cycle, very hard to break. The term neocolonialism itself has a specific origin, right? The sources attribute it to a particular figure.
Yes, the sources explicitly state that the term was coined by Kwame Nkrumah. He was a pivotal figure, the first president of independent Ghana after it broke away from British rule. Nkrumah wrote an influential essay in 1965 titled Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, and the sources note that this work consciously follows the style and line of argument of Lenin's earlier analysis of imperialism, positioning neocolonialism as the modern evolution of that same underlying exploitative dynamic.
So he saw it as a direct continuation.
Essentially, yes. Nkrumah's core argument, as presented in the sources, was that achieving technical or formal political independence wasn't enough. Even with their own flags and seats at the UN, countries like Ghana found that the former colonial powers, and crucially new superpowers like the United States, still maintained a decisive role in their affairs.
But how, if they weren't ruling directly?
This influence wasn't through direct rule, but through economic and institutional means. The sources list these means. Control exerted through international monetary bodies like the IMF and World Bank.
Ah, the big financial institutions.
Right. Also, dictating world market prices for commodities, the operations of those powerful multinational corporations and cartels, and even influence wielded through educational and cultural institutions that might promote the values and interests of the dominant powers. In Nkrumah's view, this form of control was particularly insidious. The sources quote him stating that neocolonialism was more injurious and more difficult to detect than the old, overt colonialism.
Harder to see, harder to fight.
Exactly. It was a subtle form of external control, making it harder for the formerly independent nations to identify and resist, thus limiting their true sovereignty and freedom of action.
So summing up this first major challenge then, based on the sources, the argument is that the deep historical roots of imperialism, particularly manifested today through neocolonialism, with its unequal economic structures, the power of MNCs, and even phenomena like brain drain, continue to significantly limit the practical sovereignty of developing countries. They might be formally independent democratic republics on paper,
But their economic trajectory and policy choices can be heavily constrained by these powerful external forces. That's the essential point the sources make. Formal sovereignty doesn't guarantee freedom from external economic constraints and exploitation in this view.
Okay. That's a powerful first challenge. Let's shift gears now and look at another major historical period that profoundly challenged traditional notions of sovereignty. The era of the power blocks that emerged in the aftermath of World War II. This wasn't about colonial empires anymore. It was a different kind of global division, right?
It was a seismic shift in the international system. The sources describe its genesis clearly. After the Second World War ended in 1945, the temporary alliance between the major victors dissolved, and the world quickly solidified into two dominant ideological camps.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Precisely. One was the capitalist camp, led by the United States, and the other was the communist camp, headed by the Soviet Union. Both the U.S. and the USSR possessed unprecedented military might, including the terrifying new reality of nuclear weapons. This elevated them to the status of superpowers, capable of confronting any other nation and projecting power globally. Each ideological camp revolved around one of these superpowers.
And they solidified their spheres of influence through formal military alliances, like NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Exactly. The primary military alliance for the capitalist bloc was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, founded in 1949. The sources list key initial members like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Portugal, Italy, the newly formed West Germany, and Canada. On the communist side, the counter-alliance was the Warsaw Pact, established in 1955. Its members, according to the sources, included the USSR, Albania, though it withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania.
And why power blocks? What made them different?
Well, the sources refer to them as power blocks because of their immense collective power apparatus, military, economic, and political, and their shared overriding goal of demonstrating the supremacy of their respective ideologies. They weren't just defensive alliances, they were competing centers, vying for global influence and seeking to attract other nations into their orbits.
The intense rivalry and tension between these blocs, without descending into direct warfare between the superpowers themselves, became known as the Cold War. The sources use an interesting phrase, calling it a queer conflict. Why queer?
Yes, it was peculiar in that sense. The sources define the Cold War as a period characterized by intense political rivalry, vigorous propaganda campaigns from both sides, proxy conflicts in various parts of the world, but crucially, no direct armed conflict between the U.S. and the USSR or their main alliance partners.
Right, no hot war between the main players.
Exactly. It created a constant atmosphere of tension and fear, particularly with the threat of nuclear war. But the confrontation remained primarily on ideological, political, economic, and indirect military fronts. The sources mention that the term Cold War was popularized by the American journalist Walter Lippmann. An important context the sources provide is that this era of power blocks coincided almost exactly with the peak period of decolonization and the emergence of many new nation-states. A large number of countries in Asia and Africa gained their independence after WWII.
The third.
Yes, these newly independent nations, along with Latin American countries that had gained independence earlier, formed a large group that came to be known as the Third World. The sources attribute this term to the French economist Alfred Sauvy.
And what were the main concerns for these newly independent nations? What were they focused on?
Their chief interests, as the sources lay out, were twofold: maintaining their newly acquired independence and focusing on achieving much-needed social and economic development after decades or centuries of colonial rule. They had just thrown off one form of external domination and were wary of falling under the influence of another.
This led many of them to adopt a specific strategy regarding the power blocks, a policy the sources call non-alignment, staying out of it.
Absolutely. Non-alignment became a defining characteristic of the Third World. Under the leadership of figures like Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, as mentioned in the sources, many of these new nations consciously chose not to align formally, either militarily or ideologically, with either the U.S.-led capitalist bloc or the Soviet-led communist bloc.
So it wasn't just sitting on the fence.
No, it wasn't just neutrality. It evolved into a distinct movement and a forum for cooperation. The aims of the non-alignment movement, as described in the sources, were broad. Actively opposing colonialism and neocolonialism everywhere, working towards disarmament and promoting world peace in the shadow of nuclear weapons, fostering cooperation among developing countries.
For mutual benefit.
Exactly. And creating organizations to advance their common interests across areas like industry, trade, technology, education, and information. Crucially, the sources note that non-aligned nations also tried to play a role in reducing the tensions between the two power blocs, attempting to build a bridge of understanding between them.
Okay, so how did the existence of these massive power blocks specifically pose a challenge to the sovereignty of nation-states, whether they were aligned or non-aligned? How did it pressure their independence?
The sources explain it like this. Historically, a state traditionally provided for its own defense and security, primarily by building its own military forces and entering into alliances with friendly states for mutual protection. This was a core pillar of the traditional understanding of state sovereignty, the state's ability to defend its territory and population.
Right, the basic function of a state.
But the emergence of the superpowers and their blocs introduced a fundamentally different kind of threat in reality. With superpowers wielding immense military alliances, possessing vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, and capable of deploying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could strike anywhere on Earth. Well, the sources argue that no single nation-state, no matter how powerful by conventional standards, could provide effective security for itself by conventional means alone.
The scale just changed completely.
Totally. The scale and destructive potential of the new global military landscape made traditional self-defense strategies insufficient. This situation created a powerful external constraint. Nation-states, facing this new reality, felt immense pressure to align themselves with one superpower or the other to gain a security umbrella. But doing so, as the sources imply, potentially compromised their independence.
Because they had to follow the leader.
Potentially, yes. They might find themselves pulled into conflicts or geopolitical strategies dictated by the superpower and feel pressure to bow to the commands of a superpower in various policy areas. The sources mention that the non-aligned nations, by choosing to remain outside the formal blocs, had a tough time. They faced criticism, various pressures, and even threats from both sides who viewed non-alignment with suspicion. However, the sources note that the policy ultimately came to stay, suggesting that despite the difficulties, these nations largely succeeded in maintaining their formal independence and a degree of autonomy through this strategy.
This bipolar world of power blocks eventually changed radically, though. The sources point to a significant shift starting in the early 1990s, the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely. The sources pinpoint the reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union from 1985 onwards as a catalyst. These reforms encouraged greater openness, glasnost, public debate, decentralization within the Soviet system, and a rethinking of foreign policy. This led to a relaxation of the tight control the Soviet Union had exerted over the communist states in Eastern Europe. By 1991, the communist system had collapsed in most of these countries, leading to the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union itself and, effectively, the end of the Cold War as it had existed for nearly 5 decades.
And the symbol is like the Berlin Wall.
Exactly. The sources mention key symbolic and practical outcomes. The demolition of the Berlin Wall, a physical manifestation of the East-West divide, and the Warsaw Pact alliance becoming redundant and dissolving. Interestingly, the sources note that NATO, the Western alliance, is still going strong, meaning that in terms of the original ideologically opposed military blocs, only one of that structure persists. But beyond the end of the Cold War structure, the sources identify an even more profound shift. They argue that the substantive base of global domination is changing.
How so?
It's moving away from being primarily defined by military power, that era of nuclear standoffs and massive alliances, to being centered increasingly on economic power. And this economic power isn't concentrated in just 2 monolithic blocks like the old military ones. It's now described as spread over various centers.
And technology plays a role in this new landscape, too, according to the sources. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes. The sources highlight two key technological influences. First, superior technology, while enabling progress, has also contributed significantly to widespread environmental pollution, an issue that doesn't respect national borders.
Right. A global problem.
And second, the development of highly effective communication networks has drastically linked the world, making instantaneous global communication and information flow a reality. These changes, the end of the military blocs, the rise of economic power, and the impact of technology and communication all point towards what the sources identify as the new primary external challenge to the sovereignty of the nation-state, the pervasive process of globalization.
Okay. So we've transitioned from the direct control of old empires and the tense ideological standoff of the power blocs to what the sources see as the dominant force today, globalization. And the material suggests this is driven by the realization that global problems need global solutions, and those problems are increasingly centered around economic issues. Is that the idea?
That's the narrative thread the sources follow. For a long time, especially from the 1950s through the early 1970s, military power was seen as the ultimate measure of a nation's strength. The ability to wield lethal weapons, particularly nuclear ones, symbolized power, and economic issues, while important, were often considered secondary in high international politics, especially by the superpowers.
Guns over butter, kind of.
You could put it that way. But this hierarchy began to fundamentally shift in the late 1970s and 1980s. Economic issues started demanding much greater attention and prominence on the international stage. There was a growing, undeniable realization of interdependence. The sources point out that even major powers like the United States, Western Europe, and Japan came to understand their dependence on foreign sources for essential energy resources and other non-fuel minerals. They couldn't simply rely on domestic supplies. Their economies were intricately linked to global resource availability and markets.
They needed the world.
They needed the world. The sources list several other key economic shifts that highlighted this growing interdependence during this period. Japan emerged as a major international economic powerhouse, challenging the dominance of Western economies. The United States transformed from being the world's largest creditor nation to its largest debtor nation, indicating a shift in global financial flows. The Soviet Union and Eastern European states faced severe budget deficits, exposing the economic weaknesses of their system. Western Europe decided to pursue deeper economic integration, leading towards the creation of a single European common market. Many Third World countries were crippled by heavy debt burdens owed largely to Western banks and institutions. Economic growth began shifting perceptibly towards the Western Pacific region.
And the tech side, banking.
Right. And the development of electronic banking and global financial markets essentially transformed a large part of the world into a single, interconnected financial market, allowing money to flow across borders almost instantaneously. These were all signs that economies were becoming deeply interwoven.
The sources provide some really vivid illustrations to drive home just how interconnected things became economically. Can you share those?
They do. One example is the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. While it was a regional conflict, the fear it generated globally was largely economic. The sources point out that many countries were worried their economies would be severely impacted by Iraq, gaining control over such a significant portion of the world's oil reserves.
The whale shark concern.
Exactly. The immediate widespread concern wasn't just about the invasion itself, but its potential ripple effects through the global economy. Then there's the more detailed illustration provided. Picture an aircraft. It's built in America. It's carrying Japanese businessmen flying to Indonesia to secure oil for Japanese industries. And on that same plane are French financiers who are tracking their investments in stock markets located in London, New York, Tokyo, and Hong Kong, all simultaneously using electronic communication.
Wow. That one example alone connects manufacturing in North America, business interests in Asia, resource extraction in Southeast Asia, and global finance across multiple continents and time zones. Just one flight.
Exactly. It's a powerful snapshot of how economic activity became detached from purely national boundaries and flowed across the globe. The sources give another layered example: American consumers buying cheaper textile products produced in East Asia. Because these products are cheaper, U.S. textile manufacturers struggle to compete and are forced to lay off workers.
Okay, a direct impact.
Yes. To try and regain competitiveness, American entrepreneurs invest in high-technology textile machines manufactured in West Germany. And where does the money for those German machines come from? It was deposited by Saudi princes in Italian banks.
Good grief. U.S. consumers, East Asian factories, U.S. job losses, German machines, Saudi money, Italian banks. all linked.
Precisely. This example shows a chain of economic activity consumption, manufacturing, labor, investment, technology purchase, and finance spanning the U.S., East Asia, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Italy. It beautifully illustrates the complex web of modern economic interdependence that crosses multiple borders and links seemingly unrelated industries and financial flows.
And the sources show this interconnectedness isn't limited to just economics, right? It goes broader.
Right. They broaden the picture to include other areas affected by these global flows. For instance, when Japanese manufacturers lower the prices of electronics, like VCRs or TVs, those lower prices ripple across the globe and directly affect consumer prices in places like America. The sources recall the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident in the Soviet Union in 1986, noting the fear that its radiation contaminated the food chain across half a world, showing how environmental impacts don't respect national boundaries.
Chernobyl was huge.
Huge. They mentioned the global shock and instantaneous shared experience of the World Trade Center attack in the U.S. in 2001, which was televised live worldwide. They point to African famines, which, while local tragedies, touch viewers globally through television images, creating a form of shared emotional connection, however distant. And they cite instances like forest fires in Indonesia causing climate changes throughout Southeast Asia, or the warning about the ozone layer hole over Antarctica, leading to calls for changes in chemical industries worldwide.
So environmental, emotional, technological,
Right.
it's all connected.
These examples, from economic transactions and resource dependencies to environmental impacts, shared technological experiences, and even emotional responses to global events, all lead the sources to pose a fundamental and challenging question for the concept of sovereignty. If nation-states have become so deeply interdependent across so many crucial dimensions economically, environmentally, even emotionally, how can a particular nation claim absolute sovereignty in its external relations?
How can you be totally independent when you depend on others for so much and when their problems become your problem?
Exactly. How can a state claim complete independence when its well-being is so tied to external factors beyond its sole control? The sources follow this by listing a series of difficult questions that this interdependence forces us to confront, questions that challenge the traditional boundaries of state responsibility and authority.
Yeah.
They ask, what is the responsibility or duty of developed nations towards promoting economic growth and stability in developing societies?
A moral question almost.
Yes. And where does an issue of purely national importance end, and where does it become an international issue requiring cooperation? How can nations that desperately need essential or rare resources access them when those resources are monopolized by just a few other nations? And who is ultimately responsible for tackling global problems that clearly cross borders like international terrorism, drug trafficking networks, and environmental degradation? Who takes charge?
These questions really highlight that the external challenges to sovereignty in the era of globalization aren't just about resisting a powerful state. They're about grappling with complex global systems and problems that no single state, no matter how powerful, can solve entirely on its own. Can it?
Precisely. The source's conclusion on this point is that their traditional concept of the external sovereignty of the nation-state will have to be revised suitably in order to deal with such situations. The old definition feels inadequate in a world where everything is so interconnected. The sources also emphasize that while globalization might feel like an inevitable consequence of these trends, it has also been consciously adopted as a policy by many nations.
Oh, right. It wasn't just something that happened to states.
Not entirely. This adoption has particularly coincided with the rise in popularity of liberalization and privatization policies, especially since the 1980s.
Why did governments around the world consciously choose to embrace these policies, which seem to open their economies and potentially expose them more to global forces? The sources give reasons related to both developed and developing countries, don't they?
They do. The sources note that in developed countries like the USA and the UK during the 1980s, governments sought to reduce their financial commitments to extensive public welfare programs, aiming to contain the rising costs associated with state-provided services. Rolling back the state, in a way.
Okay.
Simultaneously, the crisis and eventual collapse of the state-sponsored socialist economies in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s served as a powerful demonstration, according to the sources, that state-led development models face significant challenges and perhaps couldn't sustain economies effectively in the long run.
The end of history narrative, almost.
Something like that was in the air. In the developing world, many countries also came to the realization that their state-sponsored welfare services and state-controlled economic sectors were struggling. The sources attribute this failure to factors like bureaucratic inefficiency, widespread corruption, a rising tax burden on the productive parts of the economy that stifled incentive, and a growing inability of the state to meet the mounting demands for subsidies for various sectors.
So internal pressures met external examples.
Yes, these domestic difficulties, coupled with the perceived reality of increasing global interconnectedness, pushed many nations toward adopting policies that favored market mechanisms and reduced state intervention, policies known as liberalization and privatization. The sources define these closely related policies. Liberalization is described as the policy of removal or relaxation of government control or restriction on economic activity. The goal here is primarily efficiency, letting market forces operate with less state interference, reducing the state's responsibility for welfare provisions, and promoting incentive-based rewards over subsidies and state handouts.
Less red tape.
Essentially, privatization, as defined in the sources, is the policy of transferring government ownership and control of any sector of economy to private ownership and control. This is seen as a way to improve management efficiency and prevent financial losses that state-owned enterprises might incur, shifting the burden and potential profit loss to the private sector. The sources then position globalization as the logical conclusion of these liberalization and privatization trends. The underlying idea is that economic efficiency is maximized by utilizing all factors of production: capital, machinery, raw materials, labor, and access to markets on a global scale, sourcing them from wherever they are most efficient or cost-effective.
Lowest cost, highest profit globally.
The objectives are clear, as the sources state: minimize the cost of production, enhance the quality of goods or services, and ultimately maximize profit by operating in the most efficient global landscape.
And certain entities and technologies make this global scale of operation possible. MNCs again.
Exactly. The sources note that globalization inherently encourages the expansion and dominance of multinational corporations, MNCs, because they are the organizations best equipped to mobilize capital, technology, management expertise, and other resources across national borders seamlessly. It also necessitates and promotes the rapid expansion of transport and communication networks. Think shipping lanes, air freight, fiber optic cables, satellites, because these are the essential infrastructure that links distant production sites, markets, financial centers, and management headquarters around the world.
What about culture? Does globalization affect that?
The sources also touch upon a cultural dimension of globalization, which is fascinating. It facilitates the distribution of standard goods and services across the globe, and with that comes the introduction of what the sources call a uniform style of living and uniform ways of entertainment to diverse populations.
Like watching the same movies or using the same brands everywhere?
Kind of. The sources note that there's a perspective that this could potentially contribute to the development of a broader global culture, which, hopefully, might foster greater understanding among different peoples by creating shared experiences and frames of reference, even if superficial.
But, like any massive global transformation, globalization isn't without its downsides or its critics. The sources present a really important critical appraisal, laying out different views. It's not all rosy.
Not at all.
Yes.
Yes, the sources provide a balanced perspective on the debate surrounding globalization, which is crucial because it affects so many people differently. They present arguments from several angles. First, you have the proponents, who largely see globalization as a boon for humanity. Their arguments, as outlined in the sources, include the idea that national boundaries are increasingly irrelevant and shouldn't hinder individual or community progress when accessing global resources.
Breaking down barriers.
Right. They emphasize that globalization provides access to a global treasure of knowledge and culture, breaking down barriers to information. Local communities, they argue, can benefit immensely from global technology, information services, and access to worldwide markets. Furthermore, they credit globalization with raising global awareness about the environment, leading nations to recognize global problems like climate change as shared responsibilities that require collective action. On the other side are the critics, who are much more skeptical and often view globalization as a bane or simply a contemporary form of neocolonialism.
Back to that concept again.
Exactly. They argue it's primarily a mechanism used by developed countries, particularly those in the West, to maintain their dominance over developing nations. They see it as an expression of that enduring neocolonial relationship we discussed earlier. Critics contend that the supposed global culture isn't organic, but is largely the projection of Western culture, which risks eroding the distinct cultural heritage of Eastern and other non-Western societies. They argue that local economies in developing countries are made subservient to Western economies, integrated on terms dictated by the dominant players.
So it's cultural imperialism, too.
That's a critique mentioned. Some critics, as noted in the sources, go further, asserting that this global culture and economy aren't a natural evolution, but were deliberately invented by capitalist powers to serve their self-interest, trapping underdeveloped countries into dependent relationship. Specific criticisms are levied against institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which, according to some critics in the sources, dictate terms for things like structural adjustment in developing countries that ultimately benefit only a tiny domestic elite connected to global capital while harming the majority of the population.
That's a harsh critique.
It is. Finally, the sources present those who attempt to strike a balance in this debate. These perspectives acknowledge significant failures and negative consequences of globalization. They point out that it hasn't eradicated poverty globally and has, in many cases, worsened economic disparities between and within nations. They acknowledge its role in causing environmental degradation on a wider scale, prompting intolerance in response to cultural shifts, encouraging militarism as states compete or try to control global flows, contributing to the disintegration of traditional communities, and often worsening the condition of already subordinate groups within societies. So, real downsides.
Okay, but there's a but.
There is. However, this balanced view also recognizes considerable benefits. They point to data showing that real per capita income globally has roughly tripled since 1945, and the ratio of people living in extreme poverty worldwide has been halved, suggesting significant overall economic progress, even if unevenly distributed. They note that globalization has increased environmental awareness globally and creating conditions that have, in some ways, facilitated movements towards disarmament, perhaps by shifting the focus from military to economic competition. Crucially, they argue that increased global communication and awareness enabled by globalization have also helped to emancipate and liberate subordinate groups, whether ethnic minorities, women, or other marginalized populations, from purely local ideological domination, enabling them to connect with global movements and fight for their rights on a wider stage.
It sounds like a process with real, tangible benefits for some, but also significant harm and exploitation for others, a real mixed bag.
That's the complex picture painted by the sources. And their conclusion on whether globalization should be stopped reflects this complexity. They state that any attempt to stop the process of globalization in the present-day scenario would be futile.
Can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Pretty much. Given the deep levels of interconnectedness and the forces driving it, they view halting it as unrealistic. Therefore, the focus, according to the sources, must shift from stopping it to managing it. The goal should be to seriously analyze its beneficial and harmful aspects and devise suitable ways and means to maximize its benefits for humanity and prevent its damaging effects. It's about navigation and mitigation, not termination. The sources also briefly mention a couple of other concepts that are closely intertwined with the process of globalization. One is structural adjustment. Does that ring a bell?
Vaguely, often linked to the IMF and World Bank, right? And sometimes controversial.
Exactly. This refers to comprehensive economic reforms undertaken by countries, often developing ones, with the aim of enhancing their economic potential and helping them adjust to changes in technology or global prices. The goal is to increase overall economic output and productivity. The sources note that the IMF often provides assistance, sometimes on concessional terms, to low-income countries undertaking these reforms, which frequently involve measures to eliminate economic inefficiency and boost productive resources, aligning their economies more closely with global market principles, which links back to those critiques we mentioned.
Okay. And the other concept?
The other related concept is regional economic integration. This involves groups of countries in a geographical area agreeing to remove artificial barriers to international trade and competition among themselves.
Like the EU or NAFTA, that sort of thing.
Precisely. The sources list various forms this can take, ranging from simpler agreements like preferential trade areas or free trade areas to deeper integration like customs unions, common markets, and ultimately economic unions. The sources point out that this process of regional integration, by creating larger, more unified markets and reducing barriers, actually gives further impetus to globalization, facilitating the flow of goods, services, capital, and labor within and beyond the region.
So regional blocs can actually accelerate global integration.
In many ways, yes. Finally, the sources offer different theoretical lenses through which international relations scholars view globalization and its impact on the traditional state system. How do the big theories see it? Well, there's the realist perspective. Realists, according to the sources, largely argue that globalization, for all its fanfare, doesn't fundamentally change the existing world system of nation-states.
States still rule.
Pretty much. Yes, it increases interdependence between societies and economies, but it doesn't somehow magically transcend state sovereignty or the underlying dynamics of power struggles between states. For realists, the state remains the primary and most important actor on the world stage, and globalization operates within that established state system framework, perhaps adding new layers of interaction, but not replacing the core competitive nature of international politics driven by state interests. The liberal perspective offers a contrasting view. Liberals, as presented in the sources, argue that globalization has genuinely transformed world politics. They see states as no longer being the sole central actors.
Who else matters?
Instead, the world stage is now populated and significantly influenced by a myriad of other groups and organizations. Think international non-governmental organizations, INGOs, intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, beyond just states, and crucially, those multinational corporations. Liberals often emphasize the revolution in technology and communications as a key driver, fundamentally linking economies and societies, creating a new international division of labor, and ultimately leading to greater efficiency, more consumer choice, and increased prosperity globally.
A more optimistic take, generally?
Often, yes. And then there's the radical perspective, which is highly critical. As the sources describe, radicals view globalization not as a new era, but simply as the latest stage in the development of international capitalism.
Echoing Lenin and Nkrumah again.
Very much so. They see it as primarily a phenomenon led and shaped by the West, designed to deepen the existing structural divide between the wealthy metropolitan or core economies and the poorer peripheral economies. From this viewpoint, globalization is essentially an instrument of neo-colonialism, perpetuating exploitation and inequality on a global scale to benefit the core capitalist countries at the expense of the rest.
These different theoretical perspectives really highlight how complex and contested the idea of globalization is, and they offer very different answers to our core question. How is globalization affecting state sovereignty? Does it leave it mostly intact, like the realists say? Does it diminish the state's centrality, as liberals argue? Or does it simply make the state a tool of external capitalist forces, as the radical perspective suggests? Wow, that really was a deep dive. We've covered so much ground, tracing the challenges to sovereignty from the long-term impacts of imperialism and neocolonialism, moving through the intense pressures and geopolitical shifts brought about by the power block era and the Cold War, and finally delving into the complex, multifaceted, and ongoing process of globalization that continues to reshape the world we live in today.
And the key takeaway from the source material throughout these historical periods and processes is that these three forces, the legacy of imperialism manifesting as neocolonialism, the dynamics of the power blocks even after their formal end, and the powerful currents of globalization, represent significant, persistent external challenges. They push against that traditional, absolute understanding of state sovereignty, influencing everything from states' economic choices and development paths to their security options and even the cultural landscape within their borders. It's a constant pressure.
It really makes you think about the practical limits of national power and independence in a world that is so undeniably interconnected, doesn't it? That idea of a state being completely supreme within its own territory and totally independent in its foreign affairs feels much less absolute when you consider the weight of these global forces.
Yes. The source material compellingly argues that today's external environment presents nation-states with complex problems they simply cannot effectively address in isolation. Whether it's navigating global economic interdependence, cooperating on environmental issues that literally cross every border, or trying to manage security threats like global terrorism or cyber attacks.
Things no one country can fix alone.
Exactly. These are issues that defy simple national solutions and strain the limits of traditional sovereignty.
So what does all this ultimately mean for the concept of sovereignty as we understand it today? Is it becoming obsolete?
Well, the sources don't quite say obsolete, but they strongly suggest that the idea of absolute, unquestionable state sovereignty, especially concerning a state's external relations, is not a fixed or guaranteed status. It is constantly being tested, challenged, and perhaps needs to be rethought or redefined in light of these powerful global forces and the resulting interdependence. The world simply doesn't allow a state to pull up the drawbridge and be unaffected by what happens outside its borders anymore.
Right. And while the sources conclude that stopping globalization isn't a realistic option, the critical challenge they identify for states and the international community is in how they navigate its effects. It's about trying to maximize the potential benefits that globalization offers while actively working to prevent or mitigate its damaging consequences and manage the complexities it creates for national sovereignty.
Exactly. It's a continuous process of adaptation and finding ways for states to operate effectively and protect their interests in a world where their traditional authority is constantly being challenged from the outside. It's about managing, not denying, the reality.
Let's end with a final provocative thought for you to mull over based on everything we've discussed from these sources. If the sources are correct that economic power is increasingly replacing military power as the primary base of global influence, and this economic power is now dispersed across various centers and wielded significantly by non-state actors like massive multinational corporations, what does this fundamental shift mean for the very nature of power in international relations compared to the eras of empires or Cold War blocs?
That's a big question.
It is. And how might states need to fundamentally rethink their strategies, their institutions, and even their definition of national interest to maintain influence or ensure their security in this new, economically dominated global landscape? Something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex and evolving challenges to state sovereignty. We hope it's given you a new perspective on a really important and dynamic topic.